Hi, this is Jim Brillon. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, also a licensed professional clinical counselor in Orange County, California. What I'm going to be discussing today is something we call shadow work. When people hear that term, they may wonder what that actually means. Shadow work is a component of psychotherapy that really starts to look at parts of ourselves that have been either split off, repressed, suppressed, or have become unconscious in us. The idea of shadow work, the term actually comes from a Jungian term for parts that have been exiled in us, repressed or suppressed. Some more recent therapies like internal family systems uses parts language a lot and talks about different parts of us that have been exiled or relegated to the unconscious. And that's sort of, and that can move into shadow work as well. Shadow work is looking at those different parts so that we can hopefully shed light on them, understand them, maybe even understand the reasons that they were relegated to the shadow, and learn ways to integrate those aspects of ourselves in healthy ways. We learn to suppress or repress different parts of ourselves in lots of different ways. Growing up, if you've been admonished as a child to stop doing that or stop saying that or stop being that, you can learn to push down different parts of yourself. Maybe you learn how to repress your anger or shame or joy or vulnerability. There's lots of different parts of ourselves that become repressed because they're the parts that we find unacceptable or unpleasant, or we can't tolerate or don't want to acknowledge. So when we push these things into the shadow, so to speak, we can't really see them clearly because we're not truly attending to us. Then when we push these things into the shadow, so to speak, we don't really see them clearly because we're really not attending to them. In a sense, we're pretending that they're not there. So shadow work means making these parts conscious and integrating them into our awareness in healthier ways. Shadow work is not something that you start off doing as soon as you start working with a therapist. This is the deeper, really often uncomfortable work. And it's something that we have to choose to do because it can be very difficult to look at parts of ourselves that we're not proud of or operate in the shadow. Two important aspects that come up during shadow work is first the idea of individuation, and the second is projection. Individuation is the process of forming a stable personality and developing a clear sense of yourself that's separate from your family of origin and often separate from your culture. It's a pathway towards self-realization, meaning that we discover and integrate different parts of ourselves, even lost aspects of the self, and we integrate that with new learning, new experiences, developing wisdom and self-awareness. Individuation often begins in adolescence when an adolescent has a real need for privacy. They focus on themselves. This is when, in a very normal way, adolescents can look very egocentric, very focused on self, and they are, and that's part of their process of individuation. They're actually working to understand themselves on a deep level, and they need privacy and they need support for that process. And hopefully, as that focus on the self starts to mature, we grow ourselves up, so to speak, and we move out of what looks like narcissistic behaviors and tendencies into integrating aspects of ourselves that we learn about. The second concept we talk a lot about in shadow work is projection, learning to own our own projections. Projections are the things that maybe we see in ourselves what we don't like, and we then project onto other people. People who are highly narcissistic, a high spectrum narcissist, one of their key defense mechanisms is projection. They accuse other people of doing the things that they're doing. If they're stealing, manipulating, lying, they accuse other people of stealing, manipulating, lying. So repression in the shadow, what does shadow repression look like? What it looks like often is when you start to see numbing or self-soothing behaviors with alcohol, drugs, sex, porn, food. Often that can be an indicator of things that might be in our shadow. Intense negative self-talk and things that turn into self-sabotage can be a pathway to understanding the shadow. Looking at our projections, absolutely. And when we're self-loathing or self-punishing, that can be an indicator of where to seek to understand shadow material. What happens is that when we recognize our shadow sides, we avoid acknowledging those parts. When we see them in other people, our shadow traits, we have often strong reactions to them. And those strong emotional reactions are often an indicator of shadow material. We don't want to be associated with those things. And sometimes people resent other people who get to express those sides of themselves, those parts of ourselves that we've relegated to the shadows. In some ways, I think of the shadow as sort of a psychological, emotional, unconscious dungeon where we put our shadow material, but then it turns into sort of a metaphorical dragon that can come out in unconscious ways if we don't acknowledge it, integrate it, and mature it. Shadow material is stuff that, because we can't see it clearly, or we choose not to look too directly at it because it's painful. You know, Robert Bly once described the shadow as sort of having an image of dragging a big, heavy bag full of our shadows behind us. And we fill that bag with childhood hurts and adult hurts. And if we're lucky and have enough courage, we can begin to let those parts out and integrate those aspects into ourselves. Shadow work has to be intentional. Facing our shadows and integrating those aspects into who we are takes courage, and it's a process that has to be done delicately and patiently, and done really with a therapist or a guide that can understand what we're talking about here and help you to explore those aspects of self. Now, why would a person even want to do this kind of work? Well, some of the benefits of doing shadow work are that it deepens your self-awareness and it can deepen your authenticity. You can often find strength in the energies that we repress. Often doing shadow work can increase a person's creativity. It increases your connection with your authentic self. Sometimes it actually helps to heal intergenerational trauma. And it can help us learn how to meet our needs in healthier ways, often leading to more authentic relationships. So how do we do shadow work? First of all, you have to recognize those shadow parts. They're often the repeated behaviors in your life that you don't quite understand. We need to label or name those things so that we can tame them, so to speak. Looking at what's really happening outside of the socially acceptable and ways of explaining behaviors that make us look good. You have to start to look at what brings out those different parts in you and the reasons that those aspects were pushed down in the first place. It means identifying those shadow parts and looking at where they came from in the first place. And then owning those shadow aspects through acceptance, taking responsibility. It means catching yourself and then changing behaviors. One thing to consider is that the shadow is most often very apparent in very strong emotions, in strong emotional reactions that, again, seem to come out of nowhere. The shadow is part of the parts of ourselves that we overdo or that we hold ourselves back from. When you start looking at imposter syndrome, if you start to peel back the layers, often you can find shadow material. And what is the shadow self in the first place? It's really kind of blind spots that we have because we've subconsciously stored rejected parts of ourself. It's like that dragon in the dungeon, so to speak, or one writer described it as a dark room where you store forbidden desires, feelings, secrets, but also unrealized talents and dreams. And often our shadow stuff comes out in dreams. If there are repeated dreams that you have where you feel like you're being chased by something, but they never actually catch you, looking at that dream material can sometimes point you towards shadow material. Our shadow self is the things that we're not supposed to be or not supposed to think, maybe parts that may be hidden from our own awareness or rejected feelings. For some people, that may be anger or greed, selfishness, lust. Also, our vulnerability, sometimes even intimacy. So shadow work means developing these things, bringing them into the light, integrating them, and really doing some deep healing that can often lead to increased self-awareness and greater authenticity. If you have questions, I encourage you to leave comments and start a conversation. Sign up for notifications and like and subscribe if you find the videos helpful. And until the next time, take care of yourself and take care of one another.